Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Francois Fong. Welcome to tonight's Founder Institute Hong Kong and the Integrated Chapter. Today, we are the first section for the local chapter on Asian health tech. So, today's topic is what makes the healthcare market different. There are three key points: regulations, and regulation. And get ready for a long journey. So there are a few areas of healthcare which we should consider, which will eventually provide some very profitable business. So we're looking at this ecosystem, where on the right-hand side, we see disease prevention and health promotions. So prevention is better than cure. So if your business is about health prevention, disease prevention, or even promotion of health, that's in the long run would be beneficial to the society, and the stakeholder and investors can all be benefit. Now, second, if you're looking down the bottom, quality. So is your business involved in improving the quality of healthcare? Now, whether it's in terms of healthcare delivery, providing better medication, providing better surgical outcome, or devices that will monitor patients for their quality of life. So all these are potential projects that you may consider and get yourself in. And then we look at on the left, institutional environmental concerns. So health is not only about individuals, but it's also about the environment. So if your service or products can improve the environment, that provide a public health protections or improvement on public health, again, you are benefiting the whole society. But you need to think about your potential customers. They may not be individuals. They may be government organizations or institutions who are involved in environmental healthcare. And then if we're looking at further up, institutional accountability and individual responsibilities. Now, not looking at curing patients, but there are problems that are faced by institutions in terms of efficiency of providing service or accuracy in providing services, minimizing mistakes that happens in hospitals. Now, all these are potential products or services in the healthcare system as well. And if we're looking at the top, the long-term strategic perspective and innovation. Now, those involve things that we don't have now, but potentially can provide better healthcare and overall quality. So that we may have to think outside the box and think of some new ideas, new products, new services that does not exist. And that's important for founders to have something new, something innovative. So if your product or service is unique and one of its kind in the world, then you're going to make good business. Now, let's do some interaction. Doing presentation on Zoom is often difficult, but hopefully we'll be able to get some interactions among some of you. So now, we just mentioned about the ecosystem in healthcare. Who are the stakeholders? Now we have 8 people here, including John and me, so we have 6 at least. So type in your chat box. Name one stakeholder in the healthcare system, people that are involved in the healthcare system. Now, you see if someone start typing. Yep, we have patients. That's very obvious. Any others? I want one from everyone, or at least one. Now we're going to give a prize later on. Doctors, good. Those 2 are the most obvious. Who else? What other stakeholders in healthcare? Insurance company, very good, Amanda. Government, yes, very important. Any others? Give us 2 more. Pharmaceutical companies.
Pharmaceutical.
Yes, very good.
I've almost got a perfect score. Is there the one last 6-1?
Yep. Don't tell me it's the lawyers. One more, anyone? Okay, that's good. That's good. Academic universities, NGOs, yes, very good. Very good. So we have our list. Oh, let's go back a little bit. Now, the most obvious is individual patients. So they are their benefits that we are mostly concerned about. And the people who provide the care. So apart from doctors, we group them and call them healthcare providers. Now, whether they are physiotherapists, they can be nurses, occupational therapists. So there are a whole group of paramedics or auxiliary health practitioners that we may need to consider. The government is very important because most of the funding in healthcare in most countries is from the government. And then on the private funders, they are the insurance company. And then the healthcare institutions, so the hospitals, the clinics, other community service providers as well. So universities, they play a very important role, which will come later. So academic body, like someone suggested. And then another, like my first slide is about regulation, the regulatory bodies. Now, whether FDA in the US, EMA in Europe, TGA in Australia, NMPA in China, etc., etc. So if you have a new product, new device, you have to go through them. So unlike, now today's topic is healthcare or health tech, what's the difference? One very, very major difference is that you have to go through a lot of regulatory bodies. Unlike you developing a food product, clothing, as long your product is safe, then and find somewhere a good channel to market it, then you'll be okay. But in healthcare, this kind of regulatory body would be your major hurdle in getting through. No matter how good your product is, how superior your service is, if you don't get through the regulatory body, you get nowhere. Now, a lot of people don't also recognize what professional bodies are. Now, a lot of the time, doctors or healthcare professional, we follow guidelines. So this kind of guidelines usually is given by a professional body, like some society of infectious disease or some society of obstetric and gynecologists. So that's the group of senior professionals, high reputed professionals who come up with some sort of guideline to give to the doctors to follow. Now, they are not strict rules, but they are principles. Now, why these guidelines are important? Because if a doctor who does not follow guidelines, and if something happened, he had a very good chance to be sued, and at the same time, he has nothing to back on. But if he does something bad to the patient, but if he follow the guideline, he has something to back on. So for something to be accepted by professionals, this kind of professional body's guideline is very important. And then the drug and medical device manufacturers, like someone suggested, the pharma companies. Now then, don't forget your investors and R&D companies, which can potentially be your competitors. Now, this shows the funding of the healthcare system in US. Now, which is similar in many other countries, which in the top here, we have the tax payment from the state or local governments, which goes to the state government. But there are some other funding coming from the federal taxes that goes to from the federal government that channels some directly to the providers, give it to patients. Some go through the state governments. Now, so similarly with countries that has got different states and also a federal government, also like in Australia, this kind of funding system is similar. So Medicare, where everybody get covered, but local hospitals are covered by the state government. So where the money goes and who benefits from the funding, that's also important. So how your service providing, what kind of service to what level, that's something you need to consider. And then we also have the private employers who buy insurance for their employees. So the payment goes to the private insurers, and then the insurers pay the providers for the kind of self-services. Then there are patients who are not within the healthcare system. For example, tourists who go to a country where they do not cover by the local government's fundings, they may have to pay our pockets. Then other services like aesthetic services, then patients may have to pay themselves without any cover. Let's go next. Now, how are quality of care measured? What is good health? Now, this chart is a ranking of well-care system by countries. Now, I'm not so much interested about showing you which country is doing better than others, but on the left-hand side, these are the quality being assessed. So again, when you in the health tech industry, think about what are we helping in improving the quality of care. So number one, access to care in terms of affordability and timeliness. So if we can make a healthcare service or medicine cheaper, then that improves affordability. If we can provide the service in a quicker time, at the right time, that improves the timeliness. And then is the care process. Now, are we doing good, performing well on preventive care, on safety, safe care? Are we coordinating care better? In many countries, healthcare is very fragmented. So patients may have to go to different places to get the different kind of healthcare service. They may need to go to doctor one place and then go to the pharmacist to get their medicine, or they may have to do their blood test in another place. So how we coordinate this kind of care in one place, that's also improving the quality of healthcare. Now, engagement and patient preferences. Now, for example, if patients during COVID time, they are not able to access doctors. Now, telemedicine became more popular during COVID time because people were in lockdowns. And what were the patient preference? Do they prefer to see a doctor online or they prefer to see a doctor in person? Now, those kind of personal choices, if we're be able to give patients more availability, then that may improve the overall patient satisfaction. Then administrative efficiency. A lot of cost goes to administrative matters, and the more efficient, the more cost saving, so we can channel the money directly to patient care. And equality, are we providing the same level of care to different people with different ethnic group, different location, different age group, different gender? All these are important factors to consider. And then the overall healthcare outcomes. So if we're looking at the chart, as we know, US has usually had the highest expenditure per capita in health expenditure. And compared to, on the left-hand side, Australia ranking number 3, and they are spending a lot less, only about 40–50% of what US is spending. So definitely in some countries, the healthcare provision can be much more improved. Now, let's do some brainstorming again. So this time, I'll give you an example. This is an example which I came across quite recently. Now, this is a local company. who is a diagnostic company providing diagnostic tests. They were very profitable selling rapid test kit for COVID during COVID time, obviously. And after COVID, the COVID rapid test business has dropped significantly. So they have to find new business to sustain their income. So they came up with a new product. It's a direct B2C HPV self-test kit. Now, HPV, just for those who don't know about HPV is the virus that transmitted mostly through sexual contact, and it's a predominant cause of cervical cancer in female. So this company's core technology is to concentrate virus from liquid. So they have a new product testing HPV from urine sample. So the patient can buy the kit and then collect the urine sample and then send it back to the laboratory. And they have a promotional budget, $5 million Hong Kong. So we get the picture now. So this is one of the promotional material. They can test 27 HPV viruses and is non-painful, self-sampling, and is suitable for male and female. And it costs 1,280. Now, so a little bit background. So in their claim, they claim to be the world's first cervical cancer screening test with a patented urine DNA concentration technology developed in Hong Kong. So the accuracy is about 98% compared to penile swab and HPV cervical swab done by professionals. So we can detect 27 types of HPV at the same time. And it's non-invasive, painless, as I said, and suitable for women. And it provides two services. One is the drop-off service, so they can drop off the sample at drop-off site, or they can arrange courier service to pick up at $120. And they provide a digital laboratory test report sent by SMS or email around 5 working days after the lab received the sample. Now, how does it all sound? Good? We buy it? We use it? Now, as I mentioned, they spent $5 million in promoting the product. So if you are the CEO of this company, you have this product, what action would you do on top of what I just mentioned? Again, type your answers in chat box. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about. With this product, what other thing will you do to get at least your $5 million back? Anyone? Now, your founders, you need to answer to investors, you need to answer to your board. What will you do?
What did we discuss in session 2? Just 2 days ago.
Yeah. Contact clinics in Hong Kong. Yeah. So you need to develop a channel. Free promotion. Good. Okay. Cooperate with insurance company. Yes. One or two more. Donation to charity. Yes. Good. We'll talk about that in later sessions. Advertisement in publics. Yes. Good. Good. Now this looks quite good. This first time I try to use this more interactive way in Zoom, which is quite good. Now, tell you what. So the company actually spent the $5 million in promotion. And what they got back was, anyone make a guess? How much do you think they have returned? $1 million? Anyone more than 1 million? 1 million first time? Normally less than 10%? Okay, getting close. Yep, good. Actually, what they returned was these are some of the things that I thought we may need to consider. So before you do anything, do a market research. 5% in average. Okay, so I'll give you the answer later on. So normally we need to do some market research in terms of consumer behavior. So in the literature, there are a lot of, I started doing HPV self-sampling about 8 years ago. So we conducted the first Hong Kong self-sampling study with Chinese University. So that's why I picked this product to discuss. So we did a lot of research on consumer behavior, how people perceive during the self-sampling, and the acceptability, the comfort level. And second, as a CEO, need to consider for your endorsement, who would be your endorsement? Now, whether you should get a university to endorse your product, get a professional to endorse your product. Now, in Hong Kong, you cannot find a doctor to endorse your product because that violates the Medical Council's regulations. So doctors, nurses, dentists, a lot of the medical profession cannot directly endorse any product. So, but you can be a doctor from outside of Hong Kong to endorse your product. So the local regulations is very important. Or you find a celebrity. Now, what is your target market? Young people, sexually more active people, male, female. You need to define your target market. If you just do a general marketing, your return is going to be very low. Then after the test, what is the follow-up procedures? Now, if I send you a report, then as a patient, what to do? Do you have a referral channel to follow up? Competitions to other stakeholders. Now, you're selling a test directly to a patient. Normally, an HPV test is prescribed by doctors for patients to do. So the doctor will be able to follow the result and tell the patient if it's abnormal. So again, competition, are you playing against doctors? Then pricing. The pricing that was stated, it was 1,280. Normally, an HPV test, if it's done by a professional sample collection, is about $800 to $900. So there's about 30% premium on that. And then, now a lot of you think about marketing channel, but before you do marketing, you need to think about the product or service. Now, all these are very important things to think about. Then, the answer. So 5 million spent on promotion, product launch, celebrity endorsement, and end up 500,000 sales. So, Tristan, you were very close. So 10%. Disappointing, but expected. Why? Now, this is another product that's produced by the same company. Now, the two arrows on the side. That's my cursor. I lost my cursor. Sorry. Okay. Now, the two products. What's the difference? Now, this one, it has got a CE mark, certified by European Community, and it says endorsed by private hospitals in Hong Kong. Now, for a health product, do you think it's better to be recognized by international organizations or by a hospital, would it be better than use a celebrity in promotion? You need to think about that. Now, for other products, fashions, cosmetics, a celebrity for sure. But for health product, you need to think about who to find for your endorsement. The company actually approached the university. So actually went to a leading university in Hong Kong and approached the obstetric and gynecology professor and the chairperson of ONG Society in Hong Kong. So someone with high reputation in the profession. And the professor replied, I have not tested your product. How can I endorse your product? Give me funding to conduct a 10,000 people research first. Not until I have favorable results, we cannot change guidelines and recommendations. Now, if you pay a celebrity, money can buy anything, but professionals, their reputation cannot be bought by money. So what is the lesson learned? Compared to other products and services, if it's health related, it needs to pass the following. So number one, your internal validation. So for most founders, they are technical people. So they may be PhD, they may be researchers, they have their techniques and they know their product works. So this internal validation is very important. But after that, you need to bring it to regulatory bodies to approve your product to be used publicly. Not unless you have this endorsement, no professional bodies will use your product. And then you need to have people testing the product to use it in the real field. So the professional body, whether it's the universities, the society, you need to give some free samples for them to test your product. So some we said before, free promotions to the charity groups. Now those could be lined up with professional body, universities for research purpose to give more grants to your product and services. And then the individual healthcare providers. Now, if the service and product is recommended by guidelines, then it will be followed by individual healthcare providers. Some doctors are faster to adapt, some are slower to adapt, but having the guidelines and recommendations is very important. Then finally, patient consumer acceptance. Now, some product and pharmaceutical products, it may have to go through the patients to ask their doctors, so their doctors become more aware. But usually the process will be going through the healthcare providers first, and for them to pass on to the patients. Now, in the next part, we're going to talk about clinical trials. Now, this is something, if you're in the health tech industry, you need to know fairly well, because it's very important to allow your product to be registered to go through the regulatory bodies. So what are clinical trials? So these are research studies that test a medical, surgical, or behavioral interventions in people. So we're talking about real people, real human clinical trials. So when it's clinical, is relating to people. So these trials are the primary way that researchers determine if a new form of treatment or prevention, such as new drug, diet, or medical device, is safe and effective. First, safety, second, effectiveness. Now, usually there are 4 types of clinical trials. They can be for prevention, for diagnosis, for detection or screening, and then for treatments. So for prevention is to reduce or prevent diseases that happens. For diagnosis is to diagnose the disease accurately or in an earlier stage. For detection and screening is to minimize the risk of the disease. So usually for early detections and also for massive screening. So generally for large-scale screening, the cost needs to be low and needs to be easier to implement. So for example, the rapid test for COVID versus the PCR test for COVID. So new and improved therapies or therapeutics. So that's for the treatment. So again, for new treatments now, whether it is more effective, is cheaper, easier to deliver, less side effects, all these will make the product you need to compare to existing products. Now this goes to the different phases of clinical trial. Now it's defined into different phases. So phase 0 is usually exploratory. So usually a very small amount of the chemical, we'll talk about drug clinical trial first, which is just easier to go through. So we need a very low dose diluted drug to test its pharmacokinetics and determine the dose for phase 1 study. So usually it's already done on animals. Now is to try on humans. So that's called a phase 0. Then phase 1 is divided into 3 parts, or actually 2 parts. Phase 1A and phase 1B is what we call non-therapeutic trial. So this level is mainly to establish a safe dose range and also the maximum tolerated dose. So the safe dose and the maximum how much can people tolerate without generating too much side effects. And usually phase 1A looking at the single ascending doses and the maximum dose. And the duration is 1 week to a few months depending on the trial, and usually include 6 to 8 groups, a few participants in each group. And 1B, we're looking at the multiple ascending dose. So dose is gradually narrowed down, and then eventually we find the maximum tolerable dose. And then after phase 1 is phase 2. Now this, again, an exploratory trial. So this usually a larger number of groups from 5 to up to 100 participants from either sex, and we examine the effective dose, the therapeutic effect, whether how effective the drug is. So phase 2, we're talking about therapeutic effectiveness. What's the regimen? So whether the drug should be given once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, and also the drug-drug interaction, how we're acting with other drugs if the person is taking multiple drugs. And usually it's a multi-center study, so involve different locations, so the result can be comparable, and so reducing any potential locational bias. And this also established what we call a dose-response relationship, and also comparing with a placebo group. So double-blind control study is what we're talking about. Now, then phase 3 is a therapeutic confirmatory trial. So usually at least 300 patients, or sometimes up to a few thousand patients. And again, it's usually a multi-center trial. And this is called the pre-marketing phase examines the efficacy and safety of drug, again, in a much larger scale. And also recording any potential adverse drug reactions, so adverse events. And then with this data is ready for new drug applications, for example, for FDA or CE applications or EMA applications. And this multi-center study can take up to a couple of years in usual cases because you need a large number of patients. And so the recruitment process often takes up to 1 or 2 years. So finally, when the product is registered and ready to go to the market, it's phase 4, what we call post-approval study. So after approval, the patient needs to monitor for a longer period of time and to report any potential adverse effect and drug-drug interaction. So this is basically to the market, much larger, basically patients to use it. So adverse effect can be recorded accordingly on a much, much larger scale. So some drugs are being withdrawn because the phase 4 fails, and it may indicate there's a lot of side effects or long-term complications arise which may not show up in phase 3 clinical trials. No, so this a diagram showing the different phase of clinical trial. So I think the most important part is the last bit here on the bottom. So for example, after phase 1, only about 70% of drugs will move to the next phase. So 30% will fail. And of this, going to phase 2, only about 1/3 of it actually would go through phase 2. And then after that, only about 25% will actually go past to phase 3 clinical trial. And the duration here, you can see it can take up to 5 years at least. This is the minimum time to actually get enough data for regulatory approval. And you need 100, not thousands of patients to go through it. So with all this, it comes to cost. So on average, for a drug to be approved, it will require about $2.6 billion to develop a single drug. That includes all the failures. So per patient in a trial, it will require about $36,500 per patient to go through. And that's why if you have a few thousand patients going through the clinical trial, it would spend millions and millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. And different costs for different diseases. So for example, for infectious disease, it may cost less, averaging about 15,000 per patient, up to phase 3 is about 18,000, to the cancer drugs at the bottom, the oncology pharmaceuticals. So it costs almost 4 times as more expensive in conducting the same level of clinical trial. So this comes to our next part. With all this is money, money, and money. And where is the money? So I think now is almost 45 minutes, so we can give everyone a little break and to think about. If you have any questions about the first sessions, you can type it in the chat box and we try to answer them before the next sessions. So the next session is more about funding, for your business.
So let's take 5 or so minutes. We'll have a little bit of a break, but if there's any questions in the back of your mind, put them in the chat box and we'll respond to them before we start in the second area. I think I'm seeing, and I'm not a healthcare specialist, but I think the title of today's session, Why is Healthcare Different? You can see, because of regulation, the time to market, which translates in the cost market, is very different from most other industries. Selling mopeds, bicycles, or things like this, where the regulatory burden and thus the time and the money to market is greatly reduced. And so that creates some real funding challenges. So that will be interesting to explore in the second half. But any other general questions on what we've covered so far? How to get funding investments in Hong Kong? Well, we'll keep that question for the final set of questions at the end, because I think that's what we're going to get into in the second half. I'm reading healthcare's clinical trial versus medical other trials, i.e. for skincare. So are there things that I guess there's a classification of
Yes.
something that falls outside of the requirement for all of these,
Mm.
which I guess it means it falls out of the healthcare sector or something.
Yes, that's right. It's very important to define your product or service. Now, for example, for skincare. Now, if your product is claimed as cosmetics, that cannot have any therapeutic claim on it. So you cannot say your skincare product is going to cure eczema, for example. If only for beauty, skin regeneration, for skin protections, now for sun protection, for example, that is a skincare product. It's not pharmaceutical. Now, it does not require the same level of clinical trial compared to a medicine, a steroid cream, for example, that require prescriptions, that require clinical trial to prove its safety. So the key is whether the product is going to have any therapeutic claim. That will define whether it's a medicine or it's a skincare product. So for products that does not go through the stringence of clinical trial, obviously the cost to go to market is much lower. However, the competition would be much higher as well. So the clinical trial is a barrier of entry. It reduces the chance for others to copy because you can patent your product. You have gone through a very expensive clinical trial, but obviously the clinical trial, before the clinical trial, you need to know the product is going to work. And at the same time, the market worth to spend the money on the clinical trials. So again, for some drug or some substance, I would call it, for some substance, whether it's a supplement or is food or is medicine, again, the requirement is very different. So for food, as long as it's safe to eat, that's okay. That is the food safety requirement. For supplement, it needs to be produced from a GMP manufacturing site. So the requirement for manufacturing is different. Then for therapeutics, again, the therapeutic claim that may restrict your market, that the drug has to be gone through clinical trial. It may have to go through prescription by doctors. And at the same time, the market may be smaller. So I hope that answers the question.
Specific
Joe,
question here.
it's Joe again. We had a chat 2 days ago. Now, for smoking cessation, now if there's no medicine, now that's like my previous slide is about behavioral interventions. So you still need to go through some sort of clinical trial to prove the cessation program will work and how it compared to a placebo group. First of all, you may need also to compare to other cessation program to prove the program that works. So again, it's a clinical trial without this, well, you still need to prove it's safe because with behavioral intervention, some behavioral trial before, actually it may trigger off different withdrawal effects. Could it potentially increase the depression rate risk for the patients? Now, those are the parameters you also need to think about. Because we are still making a claim but there's no drug involved. So you don't need to do the chemical safety part and the pharmacokinetic part, but the effectiveness and safety that would still be required.
One question sprung to mind when you were talking about the self-testing kit, the urine sample, putting aside that it was 30% more expensive, which surprised me.
Mm.
I guess that's an example of a product that is dependent upon another service because when you test, it's got to be diagnosed. So was that self-testing company doing diagnostics, or how did the diagnostics fit into their chain?
They have their laboratories in Science Park. They're actually a Science Park company. But the laboratory part is a very insignificant part in it. So, but just providing a report to a patient, that means nothing. So it can it can potentially provide more anxiety. If the patient come back with a positive result that he or she has HPV, then what to do, who to ask, where to go. Now those follow-up procedure needs to be done. And that's why for diagnostic tests like this is normally provided by healthcare providers or institutes, so they would have the follow-up service.
Okay.
If more, Joe's question, we start from 40 to 50 people. If more than 100 in total, will be okay. Now that depends on the level of difference in mate. So in clinical trial, there's this term called significant difference. So whether statistically, now say for example, if a blood pressure drug would reduce the blood pressure by 10 millimeter mercury. Now in 2 people, 5 people, now, if you do a statistical analysis, the lesser the people, you need a bigger difference to call it significantly different. So now, if this program can make a huge difference in people's smoke cessation behavior, then you don't need as many people. But if the difference is more marginal, then you need a bigger population. So that really depends on the result you get. And you may do a preliminary study like 40 and 50 and calculate the result. And then if it's not showing significant difference, then you may need to increase the clinical trial size to satisfy the requirement. What's the minimum? That's really no minimum. But certainly the larger the better. Really need to start with a small scale study to have the result. And then from that result to project what kind of number you'll require. So for example, some clinical trial may involve 10,000 people. In some large scale cardiovascular disease or event, it may take years to complete. In some, it may only take 50 people to be able to see the difference. But there's no minimum. But at least I think generally, you need about 20, 30 people to show some sort of difference. You're welcome, Joe.
Okay, we're at 1953. Do we want to start on the second half? And it gives us about 40 minutes or just under that left. Time for questions.
Yep. Let me just get a drink first.
Okay. So 2 or 3 minutes before we start. So feel free to put any other questions in the chat box that you may be thinking about. And any others that come up, we'll deal with them all at the very end in around 35 minutes from now.
Okay, let's continue. So where's the money? This is a very important question. Now, funding for your company. I think most founders will start off with their own self-funding. So some will get money from themselves, some maybe have funding from family to start to test your idea. I think that's very important to at least have this starting fund to show something. Now, if you are in a university, then you potentially can start with a university research fund. So the advantage of that is, number one, you're actually testing to see your idea is acceptable by others. So if university, although the funding may not be very substantial to start off with, but if they allow you to do it, that's a good reputation. So you can say, you receive funding from a university. So a lot of founder, especially from technical background, on their CV, they actually include how much funding they have received from university granting or research grant. So that's a good starting point. Now, you may also consider some charity fund to start the project. So in Hong Kong, if you are providing some service, for research purpose only, charity fund is not usually a target. But if you're providing some kind of service, then charity fund is one thing to consider. For example, from Jockey Club, from charity foundations, if you're providing some service, for example, you're starting an app, some remote service for patients, then you may consider charity fund. Then for company already established, then there are different government fundings. So in Hong Kong, for example, there's the ITC, Innovation Technology Commission Research Fund, there's BUD Fund, there's EMF Fund for marketing. So there are various different government funding. So all add up to, if a company is successful, they can potentially get over $20 million from the government to start their funding. Again, the government funding is often a matching fund. So you need to provide some sort of starting fund or seeding fund to get the government funding. So you need to have some starting money in order to get the government funding. Now, then again, if you have a good idea, some innovative idea, then angel fund you may consider to pitch to angel funds. Now, angel funds usually a smaller amount. They may get a bigger chunk from you to start, but they usually would exit in your next few rounds. So they usually would not go through all the different rounds of funding. Typically, they would not go through to IPO. Then when you require a bigger size, then you may consider venture capital fund or private equity funds. Then eventually, when your company is large enough, you need to go international or to start a major advancement, then an IPO is a way to get funding for your company. But before you approach investors, you need to be very clear about your business. What is the niche of your business? Why someone would give you the money to fulfill your dream? You need to tell a very good story. Now, here are some what other founders said. Chase the vision, not the money. The money will end up following you. So generally for investors, often they don't just tell them how much the company is going to make and how much return they're to get. In general, nowadays, investors, they want to invest in company that potentially make an impact to the world. Now, some companies, some investors, they will also need to look at the ESG components. Some will want to see what your vision is, what really you want to do. And they want to see you have the passion in doing what you're doing. So like Steve Jobs said, your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. So if you are starting a business just for the sake of starting a business, that is very difficult to make it work. You need to have a passion to make it successful and a vision to see where your company is going to. And along the way, you're going to see some failures, but you only have to be right once to make it successful. But obviously, failure can cost. And how much can you afford to lose? That's another question. How many times of failure investor is going to tolerate is another issue. Now, from what I encountered, for health tech founders, majority would have a good heart to help the world, and they often have a technical or professional background. But remember, you are running a business, a company, not a charity. You can donate to charity when you make money one day, but do not think your company like a charity. To giving out your service or product for free, you need to be very careful in how much you can do it, how sustainable that is. Now, also have to think about what return you will get. Now, if you're donating to a charity for a university project, eventually the university would publish a paper for you. Now, then that's something you should consider. But if you're just giving out to charity for people to try your product, now if you're getting a feedback from them, they give you a feedback, and then you can use that information to modify your product, then again, that's a return you may consider. But if you're just giving out for free without asking for any for return, that's not for your business. Now, if you want to donate money for charity, purely for charity is for charity. But for your business, you need to think very carefully how much money you can donate when you are a startup. Yeah, I'm using my cursor again. Now, I always tell other people, now making mistake and learn from your mistake is good, but it's better to learn from someone else's mistake and not to make mistake yourself. Now, if we look at why startup fails, now here's a chart. Number one, top the list is there's no market needs. So 42, almost 50% of startup fails because there's no market needs. This is very important, like what John just said in the middle sessions. So for healthcare products or health products, there's a very long lead time. So by the time your product is ready to launch, the market could have already changed. So a founder needs to have a good vision and be able to predict what happens in 10 years time, in 15 years time. So that takes a lot of vision, a lot of charisma to actually get it working. And the number two reason for startup to fail is to run out of cash. That's why getting a resourceable funding is important, but at the same time, you need to control your cost. How long can you burn? How long does the funding that you have now is able to sustain your business? Number three, not the right team. Finding the right people doing the right job is very important. Having the wrong team will create more argument. You're not able to focus on the same direction. That will make the business fail. And number four, get out competed. So if your product is not competitive enough in terms of price, in terms of quality, then you're wasting your money and wasting your time. So about 20% of startup actually fail because of that on that. And number five is pricing and cost issues. So like the HPV test kit, it sells 40% more expensive than when you go to a doctor. Now that would price out people and make the product acceptability much lower. And obviously, poor product, a lack of business model, these are all important in your business to think about. But most important is about market need and your financial status. So as we mentioned before, the market need on health and food supplements, health devices, pharmaceutical, it has a very long development time. So founder needs to predict in advance, excuse for the spelling, the market needs. For example, with the aging population, with the reducing in birth rate in many advanced countries. Now you need to be careful if you're going into a market of making baby products. Now with the reducing birth rate, your market is going to get smaller and smaller. So should you better off to consider an aging population with larger market, with increasing customers. So for example, for treatments, for a rare condition, a treatment for a genetic disease that happens in 1 in 10,000 birth. Now in Hong Kong, the birth rate every year is about 35,000 to 40,000 now. So you don't even potentially get one case a year. Now, is something that worth to spend the money on? Again, that's a business decision, very important. And can you think of other example that you can think of? Something being made, produced, but then by the time it launched to the market, there's no market need. I'll give you one typical example. So like, for example, when COVID just hit, a lot of companies go into making masks and protective gear. And for those who were slow to get into the market, by the time they establish their factory, COVID is gone. So they're left with a factory that's empty and spending a couple $1 million investing. So the timing is very important. And the prediction is also very important. So therefore, you need to consider your product and services. What's the market need? When most of the population need the service, the product, or you are targeting a very selective group of people. Something as founder, you always have to put this in mind. As we said, the number 2 reason for startup to fail is run out of cash. I said, health tech projects often require long duration, a lot of financial resources. Securing funding for a few years is very important. Now, if there are potential cash generating product or service to support your development, you are in much better position, even when external funding is difficult to get. Now, this quote is very true. It says, if you find $1 on the balance sheet, it's worth $1. But if you find $1 in the income statement, it's worth $10, $15, $20. Now, it tells a company if you can potentially generating cash flow, even you are at a loss, your company was worth a lot more than a company that's only burning money. For investors, if they see money is already coming in, then they know eventually the development costs will reduce, then the potential profit margin will increase. But if after they spend 2-3 years investing in your company and you're still not making a dent, they would be very reluctant to put in further investments. A new investor would be very reluctant to invest in your company. So no matter what you do, as soon as possible to try to get some cash flow into the business. Now, whether you're providing some other service to different company, not necessarily relating to your core product, but having a cash flow is very important. Now, next, we're going to have a few cases to share. This case is in America, a company called Core 9. It has raised $34 million US. Now, you should be pretty happy if you can raise $34 million now for most founders. But how much you're going to spend on it is, say in some company, it doesn't last for a number of years. Now, so the idea for this company is instead of calling 911 and you potentially can be waiting for hours before someone would come to see you, not knowing whether you're going to die or not. Call 9, it would connect you directly to a doctor right away. So this is particularly good for nursing home patients or elderly patients who are living by themselves. So the solution was simple, and they only need to provide the patients with a medical equipment and also an iPad. Now, using the iPad, the patient can call to their doctors and getting medical advices in their own living home without having to call an ambulance or even to drive somewhere by themselves, which potentially can be unsafe. So this sounds a good idea? Anyone? Sounds good? How many will say yes? Good. Well, someone say good idea. Anyone say no? Now, let me show you something more about this company. How it failed. Now, one of the core value of the company was to operate a so-called value care basis. What that means was doctors wasn't necessarily get paid a flat fee, so for per consultation, but rather according to how the patient felt after they've been treated. So if the patient felt that doctors didn't help them at all, they could justify paying less money or nothing at all. Naturally, this became a problem when dealing with employees who were demanding their money. And also the USA adopt a very slow to dealing with this kind of relationship between doctors and patients. So that means if a patient advises the patient, the doctor advises the patient, and if again, in America, you know, medical litigation is very prevalent. So if the patient suffers some complications, the doctors will be liable. So they had a big vision and they were expanding their business, but they were expanding a bit too fast. They were also getting into ambulance service, but eventually, because their cash generating methodology, they were not getting enough cash to cover their costs. So it was a very good business idea. So it actually covers a pain point. So people calling 911, they could still be waiting for hours before ambulance comes. So if they can get in touch with doctors, they potentially can save life earlier. However, patient does not necessarily need to pay. So they did not think about how they were generating money. So remember what I said, you are running your company, not a charity. Now, if you is an NGO, you're getting funding from the government to provide this kind of service, it will be marvelous. You don't have to worry about employee, you don't have to worry about paying salaries. Then potentially the service itself will be very good. But you're running a business, you need to have staff to pay. Those are things that you have to remember. So for this concept, I think certainly it will be much better off to, for example, to have a subscription basis. So for patients who subscribe to the service, they will need to pay a baseline fee. When they use the service, they may be charged or reimbursed by an insurance company, but they need to think of a different income stream rather than this voluntary payment system. So how to get your cash flow is very important to consider for your business. Now, next company. This company, Proteus Digital Health, it raised even more money. So it actually raised 492 million US. Now, the product they have was a sensor that attached to a pill. So the patient would swallow and then combined with a patch. This would enable the doctors to know if the patient is actually taking their antipsychotic medication. But the product doubled the price of the medicine, and health plan could not justify the value. So if you're asking the insurance company to pay double the money for the same patients, for the same care, you need to justify how much improvement you're going to make by paying double. So if you're not if your product or service is saving people's money, you are much easier to sell. But if you are providing a service that will add extra cost, then really you need to justify the value that's added, overvalue the cost that's involved. Because now all insurance companies are trying to cut their health expenses, or the governments are trying to cut their health expenditures. So really, you need to help them to save money rather than adding money. So I think that's all for me to share. I want to see if you have any questions. We want to do some discussions instead. There was one question before. Any clinical trial result in other country being accepted in Hong Kong? Now, generally, in Hong Kong, for most pharmaceutical or medical devices, the regulatory approval will be done except approval by other authorities. So if a drug or medical device has got approval by FDA or by CE, then usually with one location that's accepted, it will be accepted in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, the Department of Health, it does not assess the clinical trial by themselves. So for registration, in terms of the quality of the clinical trial, so countries that provides better research outcomes. So for example, if the research is done multi-center in USA, in Europe, would be more acceptable compared to if it's done by an African country or Southeast Asian country. So really depends on, and also clinical trial also depends on the conductor, the chief, or what we call the principal investigators. So the team, if the team is a reputable team, that would have more weight on the clinical trial.
Are there any more questions about any aspect of the presentation? Something you forgot to ask in the first half? Last opportunity to cover off questions for today. I'll throw out one while the other candidates are speaking, because we have someone on the line, even though his video is not working, but he's raised an issue that I think has some parallel. And it may be something you want to defer to the second session, but it's this trade-off between private sector and public sector, and you've emphasized how important it is today to make sure what you're doing is commercially viable. And his Agus as something where there's a strong social component to it. And so my response to him was that maybe you need to look at a different pathway. Maybe you need to look at different potential investors like charities and NGOs. Maybe if you're doing something that you're extremely passionate about, but because of the externalities or the structure of the industry, it's hard to make the company extremely profitable. Maybe you have to take a different path. But I know you're going to address private versus public healthcare in your second session. So maybe you want to defer on that and tell Agus to come back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, always leave a trail. Yeah, just going back to Joe's question, another question. The clinical trial, the trial endorsement also important. Yes, the endorsement is important. Now, for example, for myself, I'm doing a research project with CUHK, and also another partner is BGI, Beijing Genomic Institute. So your endorsement, your participation with universities, for example. Now, this go back to my question before, when you have a health product, if you have an endorsement from a university, it will be much better than from a celebrity. The reputation and how believable your results is also very important. So now some university would do commissioned research. So they actually pay them and they will conduct research and with their name published. Some they will publish their name, which will cost more. And if you just need wanted to say in your advertisement in the future that you have endorsement from a university or a clinical trial done by a Hong Kong university, for example, then their charge is usually less. But if you need to have CUHK, for example, or HKU directly using their name for in your endorsement, you need to pay them a lot more. Plus, the research itself needs to go through a ethical committee approval, and then they need approval for you to actually use the name in the research. So they are usually done by commission. So that's why you need the funding to actually do that. And again, I think John's question was interesting. We've seen founders who have very strong passions in making their business. But again, it doesn't necessarily have to go through, if your aim is just to provide doing some good to people, now it can potentially form an NGO, for example, not necessarily, and then you can potentially get funding from the government, from charity organizations to provide a service, rather than making into a like a research or innovative company who would go through quite a different pathway. So a startup doesn't necessarily have to be with innovation. So it can be any company. It can be something that provides a regular service to a local community, for example. But again, even a startup, you need to consider your funding, where you get your customer, where to get your money from, and how you cover for your business in terms of rent, in salary. You still need to have a budget and consider the ins and outs.
Any other questions?
Does investment funding for healthcare always require a product or research output before applying? Now, if you're going to get Amanda, if you're getting money from investors, then you need to convince them why they need to put money into you. Nowadays, in the past, when there's QE, there's a lot of money floating around. Our investors are more liberal in their investment. So some company would need just a concept before angel fund would put in money. Now that provided if the founder itself has a reputation in their area of expertise. But nowadays, generally you need to have a more solid product or a research outcome before investors will put money in you. However, on the other hand, for example, with government investment fund or government research fund, you only need an idea to apply for those funds. So that's why in general, for startup, you may consider, for example, Science Park's accelerator program to get some small amount of funding, get your idea tested before going to private investors.
Let me make a follow-up question on that, because there's 2 points. I mean, quantitative easing is over. We're in a more challenging funding environment in every industry across the board. But I've seen, maybe with bigger companies, where maybe it's a pharmaceutical, and as you said, it takes a few years. Unlike some other industries where investors want you to have revenue, have traction is a buzzword today before they'll invest. Sometimes in the medical industry, I sense that if you've had a very successful stage of clinical trials, but you're still well away from commercialization, sometimes you can still get funding to support the next stage of trials. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes. Yes, nowadays, also depends on the trial outcome. So nowadays, we can see some company actually can pre-revenue and apply for IPOs. So if the product is going through administrative approval, it doesn't necessarily need FDA approval. So if you apply for an approval process, it may be enough already for IPO. But before that, you need to get through the second phase 2 clinical trial first. So that's why you see sometimes on the news that some drug company has gone, that the product has gone through clinical trial, they're applying for phase 3, then they quite often, the investor would already putting money in because it already screened out at least 60% of those companies that will fail. So the risk, it will be substantially reduced the further you're going into your clinical trial phase. Now, just going back to a question from Victor. Can a service company promote some medical service for some hospital, like early detection of cancer? The answer is yes, but why the hospital would use you, not directly going to the company that was making the detection. And for government hospital, for example, there is a you need to apply for a general logistic code from the government to become an official supplier to the government before public hospital would accept you for their tender purpose. So for a lot of the service, that if you're selling something to the public hospitals, for example, you need to go through a tender process. And similarly for private hospital, they will often need to go through a tender process before they will accept you as a supplier first, before considering for any of your services. So that's again for companies to consider when you go through the process. You need someone who have the knowledge and know how to apply for those to do those tender. It can be a very tedious process.
Okay, 2029. One last minute, if anyone has a question to ask, or if you have anything, last comments you want to make, Francois. We've pretty well hit our 90-minute session.
Yeah, no, I think we're a nice group here, so I hope we'll give some good information for our attendants.
Okay, so let's stop it now. I will hit the stop recording button.